In this video, we are going to investigate the Anova table from the Stata regression output. The Anova table refers to this little table on the top left corner of the regression output, and it breaks down the components of the variation in the data into explained and residual variations. So the first thing we see is a source of variation coming either from the model or the residuals. So the model sum of squares refers to explained sum of squares, and these are predicted values of y minus y bar to the power of 2 and summed over all the observations. In this case, we have 857 observations, which means the sum would run from observation 1 to observation 857. The second source of variation is the residuals. So these are simply residuals sum of squares, which are those ui hat squared sum over all the observations in the sample. If we now divide these residual sum of squares by the degrees of freedom of this regression, we will obtain sigma hat squared, which is the variance of those residuals. Since in this regression we are estimating 5 coefficients, our degrees of freedom would be 852. This ratio is presented under the column called MS, which stands for mean square. Ultimately, the variance in the residuals is provided by this value here. Now, the total variation in the dependent variable, we recall, was equal to explained variation plus unexplained variation. So this is our SSE, and this is our SSR, which means the sum of them would be the total variation that we've called SST. These are the yi's minus y bar to the power of 2 summed over all the observations from 1 to 857. And lastly, root MSE is the square root of this variance of the residuals, which we know is called standard error of the regression, that we denoted by sigma hat. Even though r squared of the regression is reported in Stata output, with this Anova table we have everything that we need to calculate this r squared by hand. If we simply divide the explained sum of squares by the total sum of squares, we would get the same r squared as is reported in this data output.